Bonsoir à tous, bienvenue et bonne fête de Saint Benoit. Hi everybody, good evening, as it's evening now. Welcome and happy feast of Saint Benedict. Today, to celebrate Saint Benedict, I decided to take a break from introducing the basic prayers in French, as I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about some fundamentals, as I now have this YouTube channel with some videos that seem to have been posted haphazardly with various technical levels of production. And so I ought to explain some things, I think, as I have a tendency to either ramble or to talk about things where I assume you know what's going on, and that's usually not actually the case. So I want to talk about, well, what I think is interesting, obviously, but I want to make it interesting to you. And let's take a few minutes to do that then, as we celebrate St. Benedict, because St. Benedict and monasticism is very important. And you'll see why if you continue to listen. What is French Catholicism? Qu'est-ce que c'est le catholicisme français? Because it's a little odd thinking of things in these terms. If it's Catholic, well, it's universal. But each country or area has its own traditions, its own spirituality, and amplifies or perhaps weakens certain tendencies and characteristics. So, before I get started in full, I would say, yeah, of course there's not one French Catholicism. But I would recommend, for some light Wikipedia rabbit hole reading, the article on the French School of Spirituality, because I found it to be very useful as an introduction to this. I'm not an expert, unfortunately, but it's a pretty good start. So, what is French Catholicism? There are two things that come to mind for me. The intensity at the level of the devotion, at the level of the urgency of that devotion, especially in doing penance. And you find this in the great spiritual masters of Catholicism, Christianity in France, such as Mère Mathilde de Bar. Those of you familiar with Silverstream Priory in Ireland will have read much of Mère Mathilde du Très Saint-Sacrement, Mère Mathilde of the Most Blessed Sacrament, who, as her name would suggest, was greatly devoted to Christ in the Holy Eucharist and was a Benedictine nun who, with the help of Anne of Austria, the great Queen of France, who was actually Spanish, although she was an Archduchess of Austria, founded the first congregation dedicated to perpetual adoration of the Blessed Sacrament in the mid-17th century. You have congregations like the Holy Ghost Fathers, La Congrégation du Saint-Esprit, a great missionary society which actually baptized via its priests the family of Cardinal Robert Sarrat, the African cardinal who now heads the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments of the Holy See, and whose superior general in the mid-1960s was none other than Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who founded the Society of St. Pius X. You have the Sulpicians, the Society of Saint-Sulpice, dedicated to educating seminarians with great love and devotion, especially in missions like in the United States. You have the communities founded by Louis de Montfort, dedicated to holy wisdom and the Blessed Virgin Mary. And even with some qualifications, Port-Royal and Mère Angélique Anloo, who, if anything can be said about her, never lacked intensity. And so, of course, you also have the great foil, if you're familiar with the history of Port-Royal and the 17th century in Europe, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. So, we have intensity on the one hand, and on the other, and not even as a contrast, but it's really a great complement, a certain gentleness of spirit that calls to mind God's grace and his love, which I do think is particularly noticeable in later spiritual authors and even artists, from Ste-Thérèse de l'Enfant Jésus, la petite Thérèse, Thérèse of Lisieux. And I say la petite Thérèse because Saint Teresa of Avila is la grande Thérèse in French. They don't call her the little flower. They actually call her la petite Thérèse. You have Charles Péguy, Paul Claudel, these French authors and poets. And in fact, Paul Claudel actually discerned a monastic vocation at one point. But you find it even earlier in the 16th and 17th centuries in Saint François de Sales, Francis de Sales, Mectilde, and it's in True Devotion, La Vraie Dévotion, à Notre-Dame, promoted by Saint Louis de Montfort. Saint Louis de Montfort, if I am consistent with the French pronunciations for names. So, for my friends who study late medieval and early modern Europe and France, I'll admit that a certain part of this is post-revolution, after 1789, after France really starts to become a true nation, if we can speak of those things. But anyways, it's the land we recognize as France. It's the country with its customs, its culture, its language, that is now France and French. And there's a sense too in which these things are just a consolidation of what came before, but now there's something new. Everything from the food, which is really written down only in the 19th century and is standardized. Things like the way at table you try and serve wine first to the women and never first to yourself, and the same with the water, and you don't eat until people are served, which I find really appropriate in general, but it's especially nice for us Catholics as an act of charity and of patience. The way that French people are generally very relaxed compared to Americans, compared to Germans, and not quite as relaxed as Italians, but there's still a hierarchy, there's respect and a certain politesse, this politeness and manner of doing things that's sometimes very odd to Americans, but nevertheless is really important to understand as someone who's interested in France, and then someone like myself who's become really immersed in French Catholic culture. And France too, as a whole, was really reconstructed in the 19th century in a certain sense. You have everything from the wine industry that was totally revamped because of the phylloxera blight in the late 19th century. And just before that, Paris itself was totally rebuilt, expanded by the order of Napoleon III, the nephew or great nephew, I can't remember, of his namesake, Napoleon Bonaparte. I think it was his nephew, though. So, all of this, of course, would affect the church. All of the monasteries had been shut in the 1790s. Contemplative life was suppressed as being useless or a waste. The parishes were affected by parish priests, the curé, who had terrible politics, rejecting the authority of the church over the state and placed the state above the church. Or, on the other hand, clergy who refused this and were sent to be executed when they refused to sign the civil constitution of the clergy during the French Revolution. And the churches were turned into temples of l'être suprême, the supreme being, during the worst parts of the French Revolution. And in fact, to this day, you can see on the portico of Saint-Sulpice in Paris the inscription which indicates that it had been converted to such a temple. This all means that a rhythm of life and prayer and of work that had existed in France for 1500 years, or very nearly so, since the Catechism of Clovis by Saint-Va and his baptism by Saint-Remy, was now gone, or very nearly so. And it would take decades for this to start coming back in little seeds. Never mind grand things, but little things. So by the 1830s, there was a very small movement, really one person at first, to bring back monastic life, which is what I want to focus on today. And monasticism is important for the church because it's men and women who follow the evangelical counsels, who give up the world to follow Christ with poverty, chastity, and obedience, and to pray for others, to pray for the world, like Christ prayed for us on his cross, and prayers of those, on behalf of those who don't pray for themselves. So there was a young man, a young priest, l'Abbé Guéranger. So Abbé Guéranger was originally a diocesan priest, but he felt the call to Benedictine monasticism. So he eventually was led to refound the Abbey of Saint-Pierre de Solesmes. And Solesmes is in the heart of France, on the river Sarthe, in the Loire Valley. And Solesmes became the center of French monasticism, and is still really the center of French monasticism. And it bore immense fruit. Now, it's complicated if you're more of a scholar of chant and liturgy. There's a lot to criticize, I think. But Guéranger single-handedly promoted the study of the liturgy of Gregorian chant, which has become the defining feature of the work of the Solesmes congregation. And regardless of how it's sung in any of its houses, it's light, it's peaceful, it's calming. It's really a marvel in the eyes and ears of men, and it's something that ought to be truly pleasing in the eyes of the Lord as far as divine worship goes. So Dom Guéranger also wrote a book that is many volumes long called L'année liturgique, the liturgical year, which is a spiritual, theological, and historical commentary on the ceremonies of the Church's liturgy throughout the liturgical seasons, from Advent all the way to the end of the year in November, December. And sure, there's something to criticize when it comes to its scholarship, as we are now 100 and more years removed from the life of Dom Guéranger. However, it's a very beautiful thing. It's a very wonderful way to enter into the life of the Church, especially when we consider just who heard the words of Dom Guéranger, none other than Thérèse of Lisieux, whose father, as she recounts in L'Histoire d'une âme, the story of a soul, her autobiography, her father, Saint Louis Martin, read Guéranger from the heart of Les Buissonnets, which was the Martin family home in Lisieux. So I don't claim particular expertise in any of this, but I do think that the spirit of this saint of Lisieux has spread through all of French spirituality, building on something that was already there, this love of divine providence and of God's holy will and trust that it will be done. A love of the life of grace, of the sacraments, a certain peace in the face of difficulty, a certain discipline to live our lives in a good way, but that is really relaxed according to our physical capacity, including knowing how to feast and how to fast. So you don't eat the same way on Christmas and Easter as you do on Good Friday. And this is all for an intense love of the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ. To love like the tender Christ child, and to love directly the tender Christ child, whose mission in this world was simply to redeem by his passion and by his cross. And all of this brings us closer to Christ's love in his Sacred Heart. The modern devotion, of course, is French. Saint Marguerite Marie was given the vision and promises of Christ in his Sacred Heart in the 1670s and 80s. This is accomplished by the Mass and the Divine Office, the liturgy of the Church, the prayers of the Church together, and all of the other prayers and devotions, the intercession of the saints, and of course the intercession of the Mother of God, Notre Dame, Our Lady, to whom France has been dedicated, especially since the 1630s and the prayers of Louis XIII, but there has been devotion to Our Lady, Notre Dame, in France for over 1,000 years, from Rocamadour in the Lot. The Lot is in central southern France, and there's no apparition there. It is a shrine where miracles are worked by our prayers, by Our Lady through our prayers. And you have Lourdes, La Salette, the Miraculous Meadow, and many other places of devotion to Our Lady. And this, I think, this devotion and love and worship is the heart of the petite voie de confiance, the little way of Ste-Thérèse. And you find it all over France and French Catholicism, from the houses of Salam, and especially, in my opinion, the traditional houses that celebrate the traditional Benedictine liturgy, to the other traditionalist communities like the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest, to French Scouting, which is very popular thanks to the great work of the servant of God, Père Sévin. So Père Sévin was a Jesuit who helped spread Scouting in France, and it has remained something important for French Catholics ever since. So, to wrap it up finally, I don't think this is by any means exhaustive, but I think it's interesting as a start, and I would like to continue talking about some of this later. There's lots to break down the history and the promises of this devotion or this life of this saint and everything in between. So again, bonne fête, and it's after First Vespers, so bon dimanche, blessed Sunday. Gloire au Père et au Fils et au Saint-Esprit, comme il était au commencement, et maintenant, et toujours, et dans le siècle des siècles. Ainsi soit-il, au nom du Père, et du Fils, et du Saint-Esprit. Ainsi soit-il.